Photographic Composition, Lecture 10, Architecture in the Urban Landscape, Part 2. By consistently producing compelling photographs in all corners of the world beginning in the 1930s, French photographer Henri Cartier-Bresson's work became hugely influential on following generations of photographers. He used only small, precise 35mm Leica cameras, primarily in black and white, and developed a philosophy that he dubbed the Decisive Moment, in which he described his process of coming upon a scene and waiting for people, animals, and objects to arrange themselves in the landscape in a particularly expressive manner, and only then make an exposure. As evident here, the decisive moment also referred to the photographer's perception of what was happening in front of him, even if the scene depicted was relatively still. Cartier-Bresson, also a painter of some note, was forever in search of how design presented itself in the natural and man-made world around him. In this instance, the intertwined receding black spirals of handrails against the arc of a narrow street, surrounded by gray cement and stone, must have seemed irresistible. That a black-clad cyclist appeared as Cartier-Bresson framed his shot could only be considered fate. Although his output of great images surpassed such a suggestion, Cartier-Bresson said that he felt fortunate if he had been able to create half a dozen worthwhile pictures in any given year. Dorothea Line was a contemporary of Walker Evans, who also worked for the Farm Security Administration during the 1930s. In that capacity, she logged considerable mileage in search of stories she could tell with her camera. Most of her best-known images from the era were close-crop portraits, but she would also back up from time to time to include the wider scene, as she did at this gas station where a family had pulled in for service. The composition is complicated by a number of overlapping structures and signs surrounding the people and a dog. But spending so much time on the road, it was probably inevitable that this decidedly uncomplicated photograph would be made. Under a featureless sunlit sky, the converging edges of an oil-stained highway cut through the center of a barren landscape, relieved only by a couple of gentle dips and a slight curve to the left before disappearing at the horizon. Looking at Robert Frank's image made 17 years later and included in the Americans, it's difficult not to compare the two. It's very likely that Frank was aware of Lang's image, but to call it plagiarism is to miss the point entirely. Both artists were working on much larger bodies of work when these were made, and including at least one high-contrast image of the receding road makes sense in that context. Oscar Wilde famously said, "Talent borrows, genius steals," and Picasso famously repeated the line years later as his own. The thing is that artists have taken what they've learned from others for their own, for as long as there has been art. And if the photographic genius Robert Frank saw the virtue in utilizing something the genius Dorothy Lang had seen and recorded before him, then so be it. Since Frank is most closely associated with the Americans, it's easy to forget that he is actually Swiss by birth and traveled extensively before embarking on the Americans. This image, made in London in the early 1950s, has sparked considerable debate over its meaning. Some suggest that the child running away from the open rear door of a hearse on a foggy, lower-class residential street somehow signifies more than meets the eye. On the other hand, isn't it enough that Frank simply saw a child running down a sidewalk where a hearse was parked and thought to capture it on film? I confess to not having gotten this image at all when I first saw it. It looked to me like the result of some darkroom trickery that superimposed a barbershop interior in a residential scene. Only after repeated viewings over a couple of years did the photographer's dark reflection reveal itself to me and make the inconceivable comprehensible. Once seen, the strategy is wonderfully simple, providing elements of two kinds of images while providing evidence of how the phenomenon was achieved. Chicago photographer Harry Callahan was as influential on the medium for his teaching as he was for his work. He explored a wide range of subjects and styles, most with a decidedly conceptual bent. His still lives, urban landscapes, and nudes are all easily distinguished from the work of others, a difficult enough feat to achieve in only one genre of photography. One subject that he would return to for decades was his wife, Eleanor. During the 1950s, in a series that took a number of years to produce, he would photograph her with their daughter, Barbara, at her side, the two of them always standing quite rigidly for the camera, as if playing a game. Although the scenery and seasons would alter considerably, the two would not, aside from their wardrobes. Callahan's objective was to produce something of a family album while exploring the impact that two relatively small figures could have on an image's composition. Ray Metzger, another Chicago photographer, furiously experimented with high contrast scenes of people and objects in the street, either connected or divided by the effects of light. After looking at image after image, light and shadow appear to become physical objects very much like cars or street lamps or buildings. In this case, two people would seem to occupy two adjoined frames, an effect created by Metzger placing his camera so as to record the building and its shadow as a continuous straight line in a single image. Here, a group of people at a bus stop seem to float on a raft on a sea of black. It's only after close scrutiny that we begin to see the details within the blackness. John Sharkovsky, one-time head of the photography department at the Museum of Modern Art, said of another image by Lee Friedlander in looking at photographs, "When he made the photograph reproduced here, he was playing a game. The game is of undetermined social utility and might on the surface seem almost frivolous. The rules of the game are so tentative that they are automatically, though subtly, amended each time the game is successfully played. The chief arbiter of the game is tradition, which records in a haphazard fashion the results of all previous games in order to make sure that no play that won before will be allowed to win again. The aim of the game is to know, love, and serve sight, and the basic strategic problem is to find a new kind of clarity within the prickly thickets of unadorned sensation. When one match is successfully completed, the player can move on to a new prickly thicket. I find this to be as true of Friedlander's work today as it was in 1973 when Sharkovsky wrote that. In 1971, Friedlander self-published Self-Portrait, a book of his photographs, all of which depicted him, his shadow, a reflection, or a combination of all of the above. Aside from his unorthodox getup, this is one of the more traditionally rendered images in the series. During one of many stays in motels across the country, the photographer mounted his Leica on a tripod or other stable surface, framed the shot, and set the self-timer. He then ran over to his place in the armchair, assumed a pose, and waited for the click of the shutter. Most of today's photographers would, of course, know immediately whether they had gotten the image they had imagined by reviewing it on their DSLRs or on their smartphones. But this image was made on film, and it would likely be weeks, perhaps even months, before Friedlander would know what his camera had captured. Gary Winogrand, Lee Friedlander's best friend, was best known for his images of the very populated streets of New York. However, this assumption overshadows the fact that the last dozen years of his life were spent primarily in Austin, Texas, and Los Angeles. And although people were often present in the images he made out west, the landscape and architecture often took center stage. There are much more descriptive images of the theme building at Los Angeles International Airport than this one, but there are none that capture the optimism and exuberance of the mid-60s in a more idiosyncratic way than this one does. A single photograph is often a record of some sort of culmination, a decisive moment in the words of Cartier-Bresson. The photographs of Winogrand, on the other hand, are about the moments in between. Something has happened or is about to happen, but the evidence is sketchy, ambiguous. The viewer is free to provide whatever narrative they like. In this instance, why is the baby crying in front of the void of the garage? Is it over the fallen over tricycle halfway down the driveway? Will assistance arrive before the storm rolling across the desert from the mountains descends? I wonder if George Tice was aware of how radical what he was doing was when he took this picture of a gas station in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. But is it an image of a gas station? It violates a number of the unwritten rules of photographic composition, not the least of which is fill the frame. He was certainly aware of the water tower in the murky dark, given that he has included the entire thing in his frame. But could something that would be so dark justify giving over 3/4 of the frame to it, knowing that it would be barely visible? Tice dares the viewer not to look beyond the gas station into the void. And isn't directing attention by any means what photography is all about? In his photography, Robert Adams has been deeply concerned about the encroachment of civilization on the wilderness for at least 50 years. The advancement of housing tracts stretching out from Denver, his home in the 1960s, into the foothills and mountains filled him with dread, and he responded with what he knew how to do. He photographed them. Similarly disturbed by the development of industrial parks in Southern California, Louis Baltz did what Robert Adams had done, but utilizing his own idiosyncratic visual voice. Both photographers had been included in the hugely influential New Topographics exhibition in 1975, which reached well beyond the bounds of photography to the rest of the art world. Unlike Adams, Baltz was often drawn to tighter views, revealing repeating patterns and textures in prefabricated facades. Bernd and Hilla Becher were a rarity in photography, a husband and wife who worked side by side through a long and distinguished career, never receiving individual credit for any of their work. Their entire body of work is characterized by extreme discipline and dedication to a way of making photographs that hardly ever wavered from start to finish. Beginning in the 1960s, they would identify a certain type of industrial structures and proceed to photograph every example they could. They photographed their subjects in as close to the same way from one to the next as possible, filling the frame with the same margin around the subject as possible, under the same or similar flat light, at times even building scaffolds to raise their view camera to an ideal height from which to shoot. Sometimes the images were presented individually, but more often they would be presented in rectilinear grids of various dimensions and quantities, thus underlining the sameness and differences between the examples. Their work had an effect on other photographers, but their greatest impact was felt through teaching at the Kunstakademie Dusseldorf. Students began making names for themselves in the 1970s and 80s and have continued to maintain world renown to this day. Among them are Andreas Gursky, Candida Hofer, Thomas Struth, Thomas Ruff, and Petra Wunderlich. Much has been made of the fact that the first photographer to have a one-person show of nothing but color prints at the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 1973 was William Eggleston. After more than a century of nothing but black and white showing up in museums and galleries of note, it was a shock and signaled that a dam had burst, flooding the fine art photography world with color prints. Not surprisingly, Eggleston's work bore a surface resemblance to that of Friedlander and Wittergrand. But on closer inspection, although the contents of his images seem similar, the strategies for constructing a color image are different from one made in black and white. He has also rarely ventured photographically beyond his native South. To show he meant business by showing color, MoMA's John Sharkovsky immediately followed the Eggleston exhibition with one by Stephen Shore. Shore chose to bypass his most recent antecedents in the photographic pantheon in favor of the formal investigations and approach of Walker Evans, coupled with the cross-country road trip practice of Robert Frank. Instead of a 35mm Leica, though, he favored an 8x10 Deardorff view camera, which required that he take his time composing each image.